Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this TA session. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, as well as your technical assistance as well. So please let me know if you are experiencing any issues. Today's topic is Workforce Grants 101. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started this morning. As a reminder, all participants on this webinar are in listen-only mode, and you cannot unmute yourselves. If you have questions as this webinar proceeds, please post those in the chat box or the Q&A, and we will address them at the end of the webinar during a Q&A session. Another reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and the presentation recording and the slide deck from today will be available on Illinois WorkNet within 48 hours of the live session. In an effort to be as accessible as possible, this webinar will be offering closed captioning, as you can see live, and then it is also offered on our recording of the session as well. Another reminder that if you have faulty internet connection or you're experiencing faulty audio connection, please feel free to call in using the phone number through Zoom on your original registration email. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to our main presenter for today, John Barr. John?
Great. Thanks, Kirsten, and welcome everybody. I'm here today with Tara Scott and Josh Coons. Tara is the program manager for the youth program, and Josh is our budget and grants guru, not only with our formula grants, but also with many of our non-formula programs. So today we're going to be going through the technical requirements of submitting a grant to the state of Illinois and Department of Commerce. We're going to focus on the pre-award requirements. So the information that's required to pull your package, your grant package together. On the next slide, we'll talk about, and we, if you can advance the slide, that'd be great. Let's see. Kirsten, if you could advance the slide, that'd be great. Oh, great, thank you. So many of the technical requirements that we have are kind of grounded in the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, or GATA. The state of Illinois has developed a number of policies and procedures that are grounded in this law. And the purpose of that is to increase the accountability and transparency for the use of grant funds, not only state grant funds, but also funds that are from a federal funding source. The idea is to set a more unified set of procedures for applying for and administering the grant funds. The state of Illinois has adopted all of the requirements of the Uniform Administrative requirements at 2 CFR 200. Our grant funds are awarded primary sources from the United States Department of Labor. And so we follow all of those rules and regulations, and we'll go through what those rules are as well. Again, today we're going to go through these pre-award requirements that go through how you approach completing the different required forms and documents, as well as helping with some tips on creating your technical proposals, and we'll go through those in a couple of minutes. The next slide, please. So, a couple of technical requirements for all grants that are submitted to the state. The grantee has to be registered with the state. You have to go through a pre-qualification process. And part of that is through an internal controls questionnaire that asks questions about your organization and the background. Also, there is a program risk assessment that will assess your organization's ability to implement the project that you are applying for, right? So you kind of have your back of the house administrative capabilities with kind of your budget fiscal, and then you've got your program staff, the folks who are delivering the service or coordinating the activities that you're proposing. um, in addition to that, there are some mandatory disclosures to make sure that there aren't any conflicts of interest or other barriers that would, prevent us being the state, entering into a grant agreement with you. And those are all documents that you complete and processes that you complete as you are submitting your grant application. Next slide, please. So one of the requirements of state grants and federal grants is a indirect cost. Uh, so indirect costs are overhead costs, generically known as kind of overhead costs that aren't specifically attributed to one activity. So it could be your accounting office, or if you have kind of an advancement office or legal staff. You don't, many times those activities are spread across many different cost centers and initiatives. And so an indirect cost rate is a way to recover those overhead costs. The state of Illinois follows the Uniform Administrative Guidelines, and there has been a significant, push to make sure that our grants are technically correct as it relates to using and applying indirect costs, and making sure that the method of applying both the direct costs and your indirect costs are technically sound, and we'll go through that. The state of Illinois does have a system to track, how you are applying, quote unquote, or using indirect and overhead costs within each project and each budget. It is through the centralized indirect cost rate system. Because the state loves acronyms, it's called the ICARS system. And in the next slides, we'll talk about how you go onto the site grants.illinois.gov and register yourself as an entity, and then also register yourself through the indirect cost rate system. The next slide, please. So as mentioned, all grantees, so if you are a new grantee to the state of Illinois, you will need to go to this website and complete the registration. Once you do that, it will trigger a number of automated pre-qualification notices to the entity that completed the registration. So a tip that I would recommend is that you make sure that you really have someone who is appropriate to complete that registration. So most likely, like if you have a chief operating officer or a chief financial officer, someone who has kind of oversight, across your organization at a leadership or executive level, again, to make sure that it isn't just for the youth program. So I would not recommend that you have a program manager. It should be more of at a higher level in your organization taking care of the registration, because this registration is good not only for this youth program opportunity or this youth funding opportunity, but potentially for other grants with the state of Illinois Department of Commerce or with other state agencies. And so it really is kind of like the centralized registration point, for state grants. Next slide, please. Some of the items that will be asked for is a valid DUNS number, the creation of a SAMS .gov account with the federal government. It'll verify that your entity is in good standing with the Secretary of State if, as appropriate. Will ensure that you're not on the federal excluded parties list, or on the stop payment list for the state of Illinois, or on a sanction list with DH, Department of Human Services sanction list. So there are kind of back of the house connections to these databases. And the idea here is to make sure that we're able to enter into an agreement with you, because again, if you don't have this information kind of set up at the outset, then we wouldn't be able to issue a grant to you. Next slide, please. Um, if there are no issues, the process is pretty straightforward. It'll send an email to you as is giving you your kind of qualified status. If there are issues, it will identify what those issues are, and you can work with. In many cases, we're able to help you with some technical resources, but as it relates to getting your federal SAMs or your DUNS numbers set up, that is something that it's not a state system, so we can point you to resources, but is not something that the state has control over. But again, if you need technical assistance, we can help you identify those resources. If you're on the federal excluded parties list, however, there is nothing that we can do about that unless you're on there in error, and we could try to help you track that down. But that is a kind of a hard stop as it relates to entering into an agreement with you, given that it's federal funds that we're using for this youth NOFO. Next slide, please. So, part of this automated system under the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act was really to do a better job across all state agencies and being accountable for taxpayer money. Right? We want to make sure that when grants are awarded, that it's a good investment, and that we are providing resources for organizations that will be able to administer the projects. And so we look at kind of assessing risk in projects. And you, as a grant applicant, one of the key things to communicate through your proposals is that you're a solid organization and that you have controls in place to mitigate or minimize risks. So think about it as we're investing into a project, and you're putting your best foot forward and illustrating how you have a plan to administer your project, and you have the capacity to do that. So the first item that we look that every applicant is required to complete is the risk assessment. It's called an internal control questionnaire. This is something that is generated in that grants.illinois.gov portal. It talks about all of your internal budget and financial and administrative capacities, right? So talks about your staff, it talks about your financial books, it talks about the financial tracking software that you use, talks about your audits, those types of things. It's a multiple choice assessment, and based on your responses, the system will generate a risk report. And based on that, if you're selected as part of the review process, right? You submit your application. It will be reviewed by a team that's called the merit review team, right? They'll see, well, does your proposal have technical merit, right? Does it look like it's feasible to move to a grant negotiation phase, right? Well, if you do move to that phase, we'll take a look at this risk assessment, and we'll say, okay, well, let's take a look at their administrative capacity, right? So now, even if you did, um, have issues identified in your fiscal risk assessment, doesn't necessarily exclude you from receiving a grant or going into a grant negotiation. Um, but it would impact some of the terms and conditions that we would include in that grant negotiation discussion, right? And some of those terms may be, some additional reporting requirements, or maybe we will have to include, even more detail in the scope of work of your project. Um, those things are determined on a case by case basis. Um, on a similar note, the program risk assessment looks at your ability to administer the program and do all the things that you talk about in your technical proposal. And um, the program risk assessment would be given at the point when you are negotiating your grant. Um, the fiscal risk assessment, or that internal control questionnaire, or ICQ, that is completed on an annual basis by the organization. Okay. The program risk assessment is completed every time you submit a grant application, because every grant application could be unique, right? So in this round, you're implementing a youth project. Maybe in the next grant round, you could be doing an apprenticeship program. Program requirements may be different, and so therefore the program risk assessment will have different types of questions, not not very different, but different questions to determine your ability to complete the project as you've outlined in your grant application. So every grant application that comes in, and especially those that go to the grant negotiation stage, will have kind of a risk profile that is set up with the project. This project will, or that profile will, kind of continue on with the grant, throughout all of the stages, right? So we're talking about kind of a pre-award stage, then we've got the award stage and kind of implementation, and then the closeout. All throughout, we provide monitoring, we provide technical assistance, and the level of monitoring and technical assistance will definitely be impacted by the amount of risk that is identified within the grant. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked a bit about the indirect cost. So again, the indirect cost rate, it's just a way for determining the appropriate amount of indirect costs that every program should bear, right? It's basically a ratio between the total of the indirect expenses using some type of base. Um, there are additional resources that go into more depth around indirect costs. We could have probably a whole other session on those, and we'll point you to those resources. But you basically have four choices as it relates to indirect costs, and you have to choose one of these four in the state's indirect cost rate system. Okay, the first is if you have a indirect rate that is negotiated with a federal agency. The second is you could negotiate a rate with the state of Illinois. The third, and probably the most common, is to use the 10% um, de minimis rate using the modified total direct costs as your base, right? And we'll go through this in a little bit of detail. And then the fourth is to elect to not request any indirect costs, and that can be somewhat common, but not as common as the using the 10% rate. Next slide, please. Again, just the location of the indirect cost rate is at grants.illinois.gov. If you uh, are going to uh, submit a indirect cost rate proposal to the state, right? So that, and again, cost rate proposal is different from your application for youth funding. An indirect cost rate is something that would apply to your entire organization, potentially for all grants that you receive from the state of Illinois, right? So if you don't have a federal rate, you could come into the state and say, well, based on our structure, our accountants are showing that, we should have a rate of 12% or 15% of our costs, right? If you want to do that, you are able to do that, and but just know that that process can be a bit lengthy, and the grant agreements will dictate that you must submit a cost rate proposal within 3 months after the effective date of the state award. Um, and this rate is also renewed. So think about this whole registration system, right? So you're registering your entity in grants.illinois.gov, and every year you're going to be taking that internal control questionnaire. You're going to be doing that fiscal that whole fiscal review, right? Because we know that things can change on an annual basis, right? You've got a change in staff, or your agency grows. You have different audit information comes into play. So on an annual basis, you'll be asked over internet, over the emails, right, to update your organization's profile. And part of that process is to update your indirect cost information, right? Because especially if you have a negotiated rate, what's known as a negotiated rate, um, that could potentially change based on what is happening within your organization, right? Um, so just kind of follow the process and go to the next slide, please. Um, of who is question here, who is required to use the centralized indirect cost rate system? The answer is everybody, right? Because on an annual basis, you have to go in and update your fiscal information about your organization through the internal control questionnaire, and you also have to go to the centralized cost rate system to update what method you're using. Okay, especially again if you have a federal rate or a state rate, those indirect cost rates will change from year to year based on what is happening with your organization. Also want to note that, again, one of those four choices is that you don't have to take indirect costs. I know that it can be somewhat intimidating. We didn't mean it to be intimidating. Actually, the federal government, when they set this whole thing up, the whole reason they said, oh, well, we'll just do the indirect costs and we'll do a 10% de minimis rate and make it easy for everybody. Well, as you can see from this lengthy discussion, as well as our budget forms, it can be a bit complex, and we do have resources to help you. We will put obviously resources in the frequently asked questions, but we do have folks who can assist, and um, we will not penalize your application for having technical issues with the indirect costs. Okay, so the key is to provide a, a good narrative when you complete your budget to justify those costs. We can work with you through the grant negotiation process to make sure that you have correctly applied all the indirect costs and have correctly categorized the costs for your project. So that's the bottom line. Don't be intimidated by the indirect costs, but um, do your homework as it relates to providing the justification and narrative to those direct costs. Next slide, please. Um, Want to now just show you, and actually I'm going to pause the slide deck right now, and I wanted to show you those resources that I spoke of on the grants.illinois site. And if I can do this, hopefully you are um, seeing the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act screen. So Josh, give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Excellent, thank you. So this is the site. So you go to grants.illinois.gov, and if you go to grantee links, um, this will do an in-depth explanation of all of the pre-award requirements. It'll also have that grantee portal that I talked to or talked about in doing those registration, um, and it just slowly slowly linked there. And then finally, that centralized indirect cost rate system is posted there, along with a number of FAQs. Want to also point out a couple of really good resources that are not only for this grant, but also for others. If you go to the resource library, you'll see a number of kind of historic documents, and then I believe it is here. It's this CSFA, Catalog of State Financial Assistance. Okay, so if you're interested in have a, obviously you're running a youth program. If you're here today, right, you could browse the list of current funding opportunities, and here it is, for all of the agencies across the state of Illinois. So, good resource to have. All right. So, if we can go back to the slide deck now, want to get into the key components of um, the uniform application. And and actually, before we do that, we're going to just go through some background, some tips, because this is a grants 101 session. Wanted to provide some general reminders and tips around what we have seen over the years as being successful proposals, right? So, what are those key elements? I want to preface this by saying this is kind of information for you, and um, the key requirements are established by every notice of funding opportunity. Okay, some people call notice of funding opportunities NOFOs or RFPs, but they're basically it's an in-depth technical document saying we are the grantor and we are requesting projects from grantees, right? And so I'm going to go through in these next couple of slides, some of those key elements. But I would say always go back to the NOFO for the specific requirements, especially the review criteria in which your proposal will be evaluated against. So listed here are the typical application requirements, and we would suggest that you follow the NOFOs requirements, you know, um, to the letter of what is listed in those requirements. So if there is a required attachment or a required memorandum of understanding, you need to make sure that is there. If there are elements within that memorandum of understanding that you are working to finalize, um, again, I would recommend that you include that footnote within your application where it makes the most sense. Perhaps it's in the memorandum, and you indicate that these are the core um, uh, duties and responsibilities of all of our partners within in a memorandum, but also note that it's anticipated that this memorandum will be amended and expanded, based on the relevant factors. So the key is to communicate that you have the ability and the information that is required in the notice of funding opportunity. Next slide, please. So in the first kind of section, again, many applications talk about applicant capacity. So these are things that you should really consider and take the opportunity to highlight. Remember, when a evaluator is looking at your proposal, they are wanting to make sure that you have the capacity to pull the project off. So these are some things to consider. Again, look at the other specific requirements that are listed within the NOFO, and make sure that you are answering all of those questions and be as direct as possible. Some proposals actually will do like kind of that question and answer type of method of listing out each of these questions so it's very clear to an evaluator. You need to realize that evaluators have that criteria, but they are human and they review many proposals. And if you make it difficult for them to find the information, you are potentially leaving points on the table through that review. So the next slide. Um, Talk about documentation of need. Obviously for this youth program, that is of key importance, and I know there's a number of key targeted populations that the program is wanting to support and emphasizing. And so some additional key questions, right? So what's your target population? What are the what are the barriers for those program participants? What statistics are you using? I know yesterday Tara talked about utilizing the local workforce areas, local and regional plans to pull statistics. But here are some other ideas for statistical information that is out there. So basically, you want to really describe, what is the need, and while you're doing this, you're demonstrating how you are the right organization to address these needs. Next slide, please. So your operational plan, right? So this is really the guts of your project. It's the, what are you going to do and how are you going to pull it off, right? So this is your opportunity to really really focus on those key. It's the who, the what, the where, the how. The need really tells the why story, right? So think of your project in these terms. And again, these are some questions that you should consider. But always go back to that NOFO, right? So if they are asking specific questions about your operational plan, make sure that you are clearly responding to each one of those questions, or you could be leaving points on the table. Next slide, please. Return on investments. Again, this is part of that budget and fiscal review. Sustainability is always an issue, right? We know that these projects are complex. We know that our funding alone, in many cases, certainly, if you're looking to establish a program, won't be enough for a multi-year project. So how are these funds going to be a springboard to some innovative initiatives, and how are you going to work with your partners to implement the best practices that you learn out of these projects? Will you have an evaluation? How will you basically use these dollars to bring your youth program to the next level? Again, some key questions to consider. Next slide, please. So next 20 minutes or so, we're going to go through some of the technical documents that all grantees have to submit. We have a uniform application for grant assistance. We have a standard budget template, and we have a standard grant agreement. So those are the three major documents that we're going to go over. So next slide, please. And actually, I'm going to stop my screen share because I want to show you. Bum, 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 bum. Okay. I'm going to show you the uniform budget. Okay, whoops. Okay, sorry here. Okay. So Josh, can you confirm that you're seeing the uniform budget? All right, perfect. So this is maybe the most um, let's say intimidating documents that may be associated with your grant agreement, and as I mentioned, or your grant submission, right? So at the point when you are submitting your application, again, just know that the key is to provide a good budget narrative. This is a uniform template that we use for all of the grants in the state of Illinois. Using federal funding from U.S. Department of Labor, we have a number of program-specific requirements that we have to include in the budget that makes our budgets very complicated. We have to track our funds using in-school youth and out-of-school youth. And we also have to identify administrative and program costs, okay? And so that's why you see all of these budget subcategories, right? So you see that there are three different lines when you look at personnel. So there's lines for direct administration for personnel, and then there is a program for in-school program personnel and out-of-school youth program personnel. And you'll see that that method follows through all of these budget line items. And so this form here, this section A, and I know Tara went over this a little bit yesterday, but wanted to dig in a little deeper, right? Is your summary, and it is linked to these tabs underneath. I can't blow up the tabs here, but hopefully you can see this 1A is correlated to this 1A over here, okay? So your administrative personnel costs are detailed on this Excel tab, okay? And you can enter your costs, and you'll see that it automatically will calculate at the bottom here, okay? And I want to also point out that at the top of these budget worksheets, it includes the direct grant costs. If you scroll down, you can have the non-grant costs, so the match, right? And this information will populate, if I can move this right. You see how that is connected or linked to this summary sheet, okay? So you're not able to enter information here. It'll give you an error. Okay. You have to make sure that you're entering the information on these tabs. Okay. So the place where you put your narrative is in here. And we know that this is just a small Excel box. So, you should expand that, include as much detail as you need to justify each one of those costs. If you need to have a separate word attachment, we've seen that in many applications. That seems to work pretty well. But again, it's up to you whether you want to use this form or have a budget narrative, in the Word form to outline and justify those costs. Um, Also want to point out that under some of these other lines, there are specific subcategories, right? So when we say administration other, right, or whenever there is like a program other, we will want you to break those down into these subcategories because it makes a difference when we work to calculate the indirect cost rate. That's a whole, as I said, that's kind of a whole other session around indirect. But let's first focus on identifying all of your direct costs through all of these budget tabs, right? And you're using these both admin, in school, and out of school youth, right? So we have direct training costs, which includes occupational training, remedial training, pay for performance contract, as well as supportive services are lumped in there. Then we have, um, let's see, sorry, jump around here. Um, um, other program, direct training costs, work-based training costs. Um, those are internships or on-the-job training. And then you've got other program costs. So again, you can kind of see, what those budget line items are. And once we enter into negotiations with a grant with you, we'll most likely work with you to address any technical issues that you might have on your budgets. We also have a worksheet here that calculates the indirect costs. And again, if you're running into issues, especially when we get into that negotiation phase, we'll work with you to, make sure that everything is squared away. I'm going to just also note that there are specific instructions on this budget worksheet. They're fairly extensive and detailed, and so it should outline. These are kind of the general instructions, but then on the program specific instructions, want to note that that's important for you to look at because it outlines our method and the definitions for defining the costs. Okay. So we looked at a couple of different lines here. We looked at the direct training costs, and you see that direct training is under line 15B. Let's see, sorry, 15B2, right? And it has all these things listed: occupational skills training, remedial, paper performance, contracts, and supportive services. So if you want to know what is the definition of each of these things, where should you be classifying these costs, and how do you define those? Look at this program specific information because It includes all the definitions there. Okay. Um, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I know we got to go back to the slide deck here. I'll try to pick up the pace so we can hit our time here. So want to just talk about just allowable costs under the Uniform Administrative Guidelines. Costs have to be reasonable, necessary, and allowable. So you have to be consistent. Your organization has to be consistent with the way that they treat costs. You can't have one method of charging costs for state or federal grants versus other funding sources. So in other words, you can't charge this grant more just because it's state and federal funding. You have to ensure that you have documentation for all of those costs as well, and that those costs are in accordance with the generally accepted accounting principles. Next slide, please. Again, talked about the reasonableness. So again, just you treat these grant funds like you would your own checkbook, right? So you're looking at the fair market value for the goods and services that are being provided, and that again you're providing that consistency across all of your funding sources. This is and also one of the reasons that we ask for any potential conflicts of interest to make sure that there aren't any questions about some of the reasonableness of costs for entities that you may have relationships with. Next slide, please. Allocable. So in other words, especially if your organization has many different grants, is the time that you are charging to this grant proper, right? So the activity that you are providing, is it benefiting the youth program? That really is the bottom line on the allocability of your costs. Next slide, please. So projects that you can't kind of draw a straight line, right, between that activity and benefiting the youth program, those are those indirect costs, right? And I know we spend way too much time on indirect, but those costs of your legal or your accounting or other folks, advancement folks that they're really not doing direct work for the youth program, but they're supporting the organization, and without the organization you couldn't run the youth program. Those are those indirect costs. And again, we know that there are both program indirect costs and administrative indirect costs. We have a link here for a whole module on how to make those determinations, and would encourage you to check that out if you need more information. Next slide, please. So we've already kind of gone through this. Again, the difference between those direct and indirect. We'll go on to the next slide. Uniform budget template. Just highlighted that section 8 was that summary that all those costs roll up into. The costs can be cash or in kind, or match or leveraged. Tara mentioned yesterday, there is a certification page that is required to be assigned, and also submitted. And when you submit your application, we want you to submit the whole Excel workbook, right? And then that way we can look at what you have. So don't do like a PDF copy of it, just submit the Excel workbook. What we will want is that printout of the certification page, right? And that is, and I'll very quickly just show you that page here. on the budget template. So this is the again kind of that. Here's that section A, which is kind of the summary, and here is the certification page where we need a signature from your authorized folks, uh, to submit the project. Okay. Then going back to the slides, we're going to go very quickly through the um, um, again, section A. We've kind of gone through this. Indirect costs. There's that should be the indirect cost selection should be consistent with what you've selected in the state GATA site. Next slide, talks about the matching funds, and so we showed you like on those in your budget narrative. There's that the upper section um, shows the grant costs. The lower section is the matching costs. The key with all of that is the requirements for those funds are the same, whether they're grant or matching funds, right? So they have to be allowable, reasonable, and allocable. So you can't just throw out, oh well, we're going to match $1 million, because we're going to want to see, well, how do you document that, and how does that directly benefit the youth program? So again, it's just you're just not using grant funds; you're using funds from other sources. Next slide, please. Uniform grant agreements. These are all of the requirements within. The state has a standard template. I believe we can provide you with just the general terms and conditions. Just so, especially like if you are at the point of negotiations, we can provide that just so you can understand what you would be required to commit to, right? And so it talks about a lot of the topics that we discussed today, but also includes many of the program specific requirements from the United States Department of Labor. All in all, it's about a 35 to 40 page document that outlines, all of these requirements. Next slide, please. Again, so you can see that it is very extensive, and again, we can provide that information once we're at the point of negotiation. Next slide, please. We will, from your grant application, we'll pull your project descriptions. We'll look at and develop deliverables and milestones, create a payment schedule, which again, everything for these grants are on a reimbursement basis. We'll look at, obviously we'll provide our contact information and get yours, performance measures, and performance standards, and then any specific conditions. So we mentioned this whole risk assessment and this whole risk profile. Any of those, issues that we have to, address, they'll be included in Part G of the grant, and that will be part of what we'll need to negotiate. Next slide, please. Talked about the conditions from the federal funding source. That's included in actually part 3 of the agreement, and those are conditions set by U.S. Department of Labor under the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. Next slide. So these are some resources that we have identified, and we would encourage you to check those out. And if you have any great resources that you think the state should share, we'd be interested in seeing those as well, because we definitely want to provide information to make better proposals, better organizations, better impacts for the youth and other participants that we're serving. Next slide, please. So this is my contact information, and also on the program website, which I just want to go to here before we open up for questions here. Want to point out that the program website includes all of, to make sure I'm on the right page, yes, the Career Pathway Program Notice of Funding Opportunity includes Tara Scott's information and outlines all of these requirements. And again, this is where all of these key documents are located. So again, this is that NOFO that you must, kind of refer to and answer all those questions. There's an application checklist. There's here's your summary information with the attachments and templates that you should use. Here's your uniform application, right? So that's basically, it's kind of like like an application cover sheet, right? You've got your GATA budget that we went through in quite a bit of detail. So yeah, this is your resource place. There'll be frequently asked questions here. And so for those of you who can't hang around for the Q&A, definitely feel free to add those questions here. And if you're still running into trouble, definitely connect with Tara, and she'll be able to help you navigate through the information. Here's her email here, tara.scott@illinois.gov, and some other technical assistance sessions that we would encourage you to participate in or watch when you are available. So with that, I will
I
stop.
just wanted to highlight the numbers that were there
Oh, yes.
for the
Okay.
application. We added those yesterday. So if you were on the call, when you are completing your application, you're going to need to put in your these numbers to show the funding source, and
Right.
that goes on the uniform application that's above. It's a
Yep.
PDF file.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Thanks for that, Tara. And that was one thing. Again, if you so this uniform application is one that we didn't show, but if while we're scrolling here and queuing up some of the questions, you can if it'll let us here. Okay, so this is just kind of the uniform application. I know Tara went through this a little bit yesterday, showed you, and you put in those that CSFA number. You put that there, and then you put the CFDA number down in lines 7, 8, 9, 10, and then the additional, because we have 3 CFDA numbers. And for those of you who want to know the technical background, the reason we have 3 catalog of federal domestic assistance, right? So it's basically the federal funding source, right? Through the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, there's actually 3 programs: a youth, a dislocated worker, and adult, all combined into one big grant that's sent to the states, which is then we're utilizing our statewide activities funds to support this youth funding. And so that is why we have to enter in 3 CFDA numbers. And your fiscal folks may be confused to say, well, why does it say we're serving adults when we're submitting a youth proposal, right? Well, that's the reason why, because we've got three CFDAs that support WIOA statewide activities, and one of those required and allowable statewide activity is to provide additional youth funding in areas of the state where it is needed. So with that, I will pause, and I know we're a bit over here, but happy to take questions and work through those questions if folks want to hang on, or can listen and come back, or we can also put some of this information into the FAQ.
There are no questions as of right now in the chat, John.
Okay, well, how about that? We must have covered it all.
Yeah, you must have covered it all. So I just wanted to reiterate to everyone that this was recorded and it'll be up on Illinois WorkNet within 48 hours, as well as the slide deck if you need to access this information at a later date. And then anything else, Tara or John?
No, that's it. I
Yeah.
think we've covered it all.
Well,
Make sure you sign up for more sessions.
Yes,
Great.
thank you so much, everyone, and be sure to register for more of the TA sessions that are going on next week as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Very good. Thank you. Bye-bye.